It was a bit scary, but then equity came in and it gave me a new identity and it gave me a new purpose. And what I realized as well, and it's also why I decided to dance in Flint. I need to do something I'm passionate about and purpose. Every time I was doing something new, I could take the skills that I learned from the previous job and not feel so lost. You
Sure.
kind of learn how to manage a group of people and developing a credibility with them as well, so that they can trust you. So there's a question of trust as well. And I think my background as an artist, even though it was in the circus, they gave me that credibility of knowing what they were going through as well.
Mm. And welcome to the Theatre Art Life podcast. Today we're talking with Richard Dagenais. With over 35 years of experience and success in the performing arts industry, working as a creator and creative manager, Richard has been involved in creating international live shows, both in permanent and touring venues, corporate and touristic events, FECs and theme parks. He's well versed in leading different styles of creative processes and successfully guiding teams to overcome complex challenges. Born and raised in Montreal, Richard's decade-long dance career with the Royal Winnipeg Ballet gave him the chance to travel the world and work with some of the best choreographers in the industry, honing his artistic skills. After 18 years working with Cirque du Soleil as head of auditions, senior artistic director and senior creative director, and a year in Dubai working on Franco Dragone's Perle, he joined the live entertainment leader that is Cirque Eloize as its vice president of creation. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I know a lot about your work now, but let's go back to the beginning. So you started as a ballet dancer. So what was the path that led you to dance?
It's a really very atypical path for me. My family was not very artistic. My father was an engineer. My mom was a school teacher. My brother is a social worker, and my sister works in insurance. So really, I was kind of the oddball here in the family. But the one thing, though, is that there was always music in my house. Always listening to something, whether it was jazz, classical, and some of the crooners at the time. My love for music developed at that point, and I kind of knew in the back of my head that I wanted to do something with music because it moved me so much that I couldn't not be around music. However, I was a lousy musician. I tried accordion, I tried guitar, I tried a whole bunch of things, and it didn't work. I didn't have the head for it. And then at one point later, after my teens, because I played a lot of sports during my teenage years, and I decided to take a dance class on a dare from a friend of mine, and I loved it. And this is where I realized that my connection with music could be dance, but at that point it was just as a hobby. And I moved to Winnipeg to go to university, and at that point I continued to take dance class as a hobby, just to be able to meet people, hone my skills in English because I didn't speak a lot of English back then. And I really loved it. And my teacher said, well, we need guys for the professional school, and why don't you apply? And I did, and I left university and decided to dance. So at that point I was 20 years old. And then I finished the school, I graduated. My third year in the school, I started working with the company on full-length ballets. They offered me a job, and then I stayed there I stayed in Winnipeg for 12 years. So it was quite the experience. I traveled all over the world with them. But it's a bit of an unusual path for me, but I loved it, really. I discovered a passion that I didn't know I had.
And what was the things that you take away from your time as being a dancer? Like, what did you learn about the industry and about arts and performance?
Well, for me, one of the things is I love to observe, and I have a bit of an introverted tendency sometimes, and in a crowd, especially, I tend to fall back a little bit and observe the dynamics. And I looked a lot on the dynamic of how ballet companies function, and I learned a lot. I remember my first year in the as a corps de ballet, because I started as an apprentice. When I was in the corps de ballet, they elected me to be the dancers rep, because we were an equity company back then. Well, still today, but we're an equity company. They needed a rep, and nobody wanted to do it. So it's like, let's give it to the new guy. So I took it on, and I really enjoyed it. So I spent about 8 years working as their rep, going into Toronto to the National Council, eventually being elected secretary of the union. And this is why I learned the business side of it, the contract negotiations, but also the dynamic of that social or political environment that happens in a creative company. And it was really eye-opening in that sense, and taught me a lot about how to approach people, mediation, what to ask, when to push, when to fall back, why the company asks for certain things, when do they go too much and they take advantage of a situation, but when do they really need it? Like, to be able to look through that was really interesting for me. I kind of developed at that point another passion, which was not a bit of an advocate, but really this relationship that happens in arts between the engager and the artist, and continue to learn a lot about this. So that was one of the things that was really interesting, that really helped me after that in my career. The other thing too was this relationship that you develop with the audience when you're on stage. And what does that mean? Because at first time you go on stage as a performer, you kind of a bit like a deer in headlights, but at some point you kind of relax a little bit, and you start noticing that there's people there watching you, and enjoying it, expecting certain things. And I was fascinated by that relationship, and you almost become addicted to it. It's something that every show that you go on, even though you have a different audience, you sort of nurture. You can make the choice to nurture that relationship by giving them as much as you can, and realizing that then when you do that, they give back. And that back and forth creates this experience. For me, was literally addictive. I loved it. I loved being on stage. And really, the other thing too, short of the art world and the intention of the choreographers and the relationship with the music that we have as dancers, it was also the idea that as an artist, it is really a calling. There's so many times people ask me, so what are you going to do when you grow up? That cliche thing where arts is not necessarily considered a real profession. But then you start digging into the impact of arts on society, on the economy, on the general well-being of people that come to watch it, but also that do it. And then you start realizing how important arts is in our society, how essential really it is. And that was really eye-opening for me too.
It's such a fundamental facet of what I loved when you said about your relationship with the audience. It's something that it's one of the things that can't really be replaced through movies or through other mediums, right? And so one of the things that I think as we evolve in also this digital era, the advantage of live performance is that relationship between the audience and the people. And it's, it's super, super important. And so in your career, what was the transition from performer into the next thing that was beyond a performer? Because a lot of performers, an exit from the stage is a large step in their life, right? And it can be an emotional one depending on what is next. What was that like for you?
What was interesting with me is I was kind of, as I nourished my interest, and I was always being curious. Like I said, I like to observe and learn. I didn't realize that I kept paving the way for the next step. So working with, as the dance representative, when I was dancing with the company, made me aware of the associations of Canadian Actors Equity, started getting involved, learning different collective agreements, and so on. So when I decided to retire from dance, there was this opportunity to go to Toronto to work for Canadian Actors Equity as a business representative. And I took it, and it became, because the one thing that I was very afraid of when I finished dancing, and I think a lot of the dancers, acrobats that are in circus also feel this, is the loss of identity. Because it's more than just a job, like I said, it's a calling, and it encompasses all your life. Because if you're smart and you don't want to get injured, then you take care of your bodies, which means that your lifestyle has to be adapted to this profession. So when you finish dancing and you don't have to do that anymore, and you cannot say, there's nothing worse than saying, well, I'm an ex-dancer, So I going from dance to I didn't know when, because at first I was going to university. I had a struggle with that. Okay, I'm a student, or I don't know yet, or I was 32 years old, and it was a bit scary. But then equity came in, and it gave me a new identity, and it gave me a new purpose. And what I realized as well, and it's also why I decided to dance at Flanks, I need to do something I'm passionate about that gives me purpose. So equity gave me that. And all the years that I had volunteered for equity, because you don't get paid when you're a dancer's rep, taught me what I needed to become a business representative, which I did for about 5 years. It was easier than I expected, in a way.
You had a good landing on that then.
Exactly. Yeah, no,
but only
exactly.
because you'd built up the equity while you were a performer, right? I think that's a really important point, that there was something in the works. You weren't just performing, and there was groundwork being laid.
No, exactly. And probably the biggest thing that performers, especially performers that are in art forms that are very physical, like dance, like circus, it's so important to build that equity, to build these secondary skills or knowledges that will help you later on figure out what you want to do, what you're good at, and save you a little bit of time, because there's so many people that it's cool to live in the moment, but at the same time, because it's so physical, if there's a bad luck that happens, you have an injury, and you have to cut your career. It's not when you want to, but when this injury tells you to. A lot of time you're caught by surprise and you don't know what to do, and there's a real moment there of panic, right? That can happen. I've seen it so many times with young performers that, I'm going to perform until I'm 40, and then I'll do this and I'll do that, and then they're 28, and all of a sudden they don't have a choice. They have to stop, and they're not prepared. Not only are they not prepared financially, which it's one of the things that my father taught me, always put a little bit aside in case of emergency, but it's mentally and emotionally. You have to be prepared to leave that behind, especially when you don't want to, and that's tough.
Yeah, I have experienced in my career watching people go through that, and I have a lot of empathy when they haven't been prepared, because it's quite a big event in their life to have to walk away from a performance career. And I always say, keep planning for plan B. Even if you get to 40 and you're a performer, you should still have a plan B, right?
Always.
So did you go from equity? Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Did you go from equity then to Cirque du Soleil? What was that transition, and what was your foray into the circus arena?
Really, it was another beautiful accident. There's a friend of mine who was in Montreal. She was an Anglophone, and she saw this position at Cirque du Soleil. It was a contract negotiator. She gave me a call and said, what do you think? You work at equity, and what do you think my chances are? I want to apply for it. And we talked for a little bit, and I said, well, how's your French? Because you're in Quebec, and you're probably going to need to be bilingual. And she said, well, I'm not very good right now, especially written speaking, so anyway, so she said, well, why don't you apply because you're bilingual? And so why not? So I applied. I went to Montreal for an interview, and they gave me the job. So again, because of my background in contract negotiation and collective agreement and so on with equity, it was perfect for the position they were looking for. They were building the department, which was at that time part of the casting department at Cirque du Soleil. Now it's part of human resource, so the profile has changed. I probably, if I would have applied today, I'm not sure if I would have gotten it because now they're hiring lawyers to do this part.
Right.
At the time, it wasn't. So we were working with the legal department at Cirque du Soleil. So it was a beautiful accident. And from there, so I applied. They gave me the job. I moved. Me and my wife moved from Toronto to Montreal. Decided to make that big move and contract negotiation for about 4 years. Then there was an opening on tour as artistic director, or at that point they called it artistic coordinator, and they changed after to artistic director, but it was the same position on Saltimbanco. Then Corteo, so I left on tour for about 3 years. Yeah, I stayed about 18 years with Cirque du Soleil. It was amazing school because the great thing with Cirque du Soleil is because it's such a particular culture. Like circus is a particular culture in itself. Cirque du Soleil and its environment, and when we talk about the social and political ecosystem within creative company, each company had their own little village or bubble, right? And Cirque had its own, and we can't really learn that in school. You can't get a BA in Cirque du Soleil or what they do. But they were very much willing to teach you. And I had this amazing mentor back then. Her name was Mariette Fontaine. And she was an amazing woman that gave me this opportunity to risk doing something that I wasn't quite sure if I knew it. It's almost like she saw that I could do it, that I had the skill to do it. I had definitely the passion to do it. I made a lot of mistakes, but she kept pushing me and giving me those opportunities. So I went on tour, then I came back as a senior artistic director. Then they had this event department. I became creative director for the event department. So we're doing, premiere parties and weddings and little things like this. Eventually we started doing shows for cities like Quebec City or Trois-Rivières or Andorra. And then it grew from there. So I learned every time I was doing something new, I could take the skills that I learned from the previous job and not feel so lost, in the new position. And it kept going like this. So that's why, for me, it's really interesting looking back in my career that I sort of, without knowing it, sort of kept paving the way for what could be coming, what was coming after.
Was there any advocacy you had to do from being the contract guy into the creative branch of Cirque? Because that seems like a little bit of a leap. I mean, I know you had the background of ballet, but generally if you're doing the contracts, they were like, you're the next creative director. How did that jump happen?
Well, there was a between going on tour to contract, I took care of the auditions as well.
Took care of the what, sorry?
The audition.
Oh, okay.
Those head of auditions. But I think my background in dance and a little bit of choreography that I did in the past, but sort of allowed me to convince them that I could do it. However, artistic director on tour is much more a managerial position than it is a creative position. You don't create anything. You're there to maintain a show that's been created. And the parameters that you have are very clear. You're not there to redo the show. Yes, sometimes you have to integrate. You need to inspire the artists because they're doing the same thing day in, day out. You also sometimes have to tweak your notes. But that I could do. And I think also the fact that my 8 years on the Council of Equity, plus the 4 or 5 years that I did in Toronto as a business rep, allowed me to also develop skills on how to manage artists, big group of artists, because sometimes you have to stand in front of a huge group of angry artists that are pissed off at the union because they didn't get exactly what they wanted, and you need to navigate into that. It's not much different than an artistic director going to Perle talking to a bunch of artists that are not necessarily happy because the kitchen food was sucked that week, right? So
That's
you
true.
kind of learn how to manage big group of people and developing a credibility with them as well, so that they can trust you. So there's a question of trust as well. And I think my background as an artist, even though it wasn't in circus, they gave me that credibility of knowing what they were going through as well.
And now a note from our sponsor. The Theatre Out Live podcast is proud to be sponsored by ClearCom. ClearCom is the leader in voice communications since 1968 for theatre and the performing arts. When the show must go on, ClearCom is there to keep the team on cue. You can find them at clearcom.com. Go check them out. It's interesting that you say that. I think because probably there would be a perception outside the circus world that we might know that an artistic director is quite artistic, but that you say that there's a lot of managerial aspects of that role, right? If you could put a percentage to management versus artistic notes in the role of an artistic director in that kind of construct, would it be 75% management, 25% artistic? Like, what would you, because you want to be realistic, right? Like about what that role is when you go into it, because I think a lot of people may think it is heavily artistic, but it is. I've seen it as a managerial role, very much so.
Obviously, it changes from week to week, but in general, it's you have to give notes to the artists, and they always want notes. But that's an artistic aspect in your work team. But I would say 70-30, depending. Some weeks a little bit less. So, some weeks you spend more time. Those are good weeks. Spend more time working on artistic aspect. Other weeks can go up to 80-20, and sometimes 100% just management because you have no time to do anything. So it depends on the week.
Yeah.
We try as much as possible to spend time on artistic things, but there's a difference in doing the artistic component to an artistic director versus a creative component, because the creative component where you create something new is rare, because as I said, your role is to maintain the vision of somebody else. It's not about your vision. It's not about what you think is best. If there's an act and the creators said, well, this is the act that I want, this is the level that I want, this kind of profile, and you think, well, that's not right, and there's something else better, well, tough. Create your own show, and then you can do whatever you want. And that needs to be accepted by an artistic director, because there's a real respect that you need to give creators that spend so much time putting their vision. It doesn't mean that you don't tweak certain things. I was working on a certain show, and I was able to talk to the original director of the show to suggest certain things, or to my senior artistic director to say, well, what about this? And they would say, well, try it and show me, and then they would say if it's good or not, if keep it or not. But in general, you're there to maintain something. So the artistic aspect can vary, and sometimes you're lucky, you can do some workshops with them. I remember we used to go to a new city, and I would connect with some entities, artistic entities, whether it's a flamenco company, a dance company, a theater company, and invite them and have exchange with our artists. So this artistic development component was important, and I loved doing that. But the creation aspect of it was much smaller.
So you now work for Cirque Eloize, and not all of our listeners live in the circus world. So can you explain to our audience what Cirque Eloize is and what your role is now?
Cirque Eloize celebrates this year 30 years of existence. It's a circus company, what we call contemporary circus, that started in Montreal. It's some people, some friends from the Magdalena Islands that got together. We were students at the National Circus School here in Montreal 30 years ago. They decided at one point to do a show together. They presented it at National Circus School, which was at the Dalhousie station, train station, which is where we are right now in the old Montreal. And they did a show. It was successful. They decided to get together and not unsimilar to Seven Fingers or Fabric or those smaller companies where you have a bunch of friends that decide that they love working with each other, so why not create a company? So Jean Pinchot and some of his other friends from the Magdalena Islands decided to create Cirque Eloize. And their signature and what made them sort of different in a way from companies like Cirque du Soleil is that their mandate and the venue that they wanted to do circus in was the existing theater. So singing theaters that existed all over the place, and to bring circus to smaller places, but that are all over the place, all over the world. So really utilize the proscenium theater to create their shows, as opposed to big tops or arenas like Ringling Brothers or Cirque du Soleil were doing. So it created a lot of very poetic shows like Rain, Nibia, the Pasca Passage to it was still beautiful shows that it was produced and created. Shows like ID, Sarcopolis, always something that it's entertainment with meaning in a way, or art with meaning. So General likes to have a bit of a message in what he does. So 30 years this year, so we're pretty proud of it. My role is as vice president creation is really to support Jeannot in his vision, go and help bring teams together, create new type of shows, experiences that takes Eloize sort of DNA and integrate it in experiences like immersive experience, or we did like in pandemic at one point we started doing movies. We're just representing a podcast. So we're trying to diversify a little bit to see where the creative skills that we own over the 30 years, where can we also put it outside the normal show? We're still doing normal shows. We're actually going on tour for the first time after the pandemic this summer with a new show. And a new show that's going to start at the Magdalena Islands, but then after that's going to tour to Quebec and then Europe. So we're pretty proud of that. And it has the sort of storytelling of legends of the islands with music that are traditional from the islands, with a group of musicians that are from there. So it's very dear to Jeannot's heart, this show, because it's where he's from. And being able to share that with outside the islands for him, it's quite special. So
that's amazing.
We are. Yeah.
I want to see that. I want to ask you, do you think that
just before, sorry to interrupt you, but a little fun fact is, for those of you, one of the founders of Cirque Eloize is also Daniel Cyr, who invented the Lucia. So that was one of for people know Lucille now, but not everybody knows that it was one of the founders of Cirque Eloize that created it.
Well, there you go. That's super interesting. I didn't know that. I wanted to ask, like, is that desire to diversify, or that need to diversify, do you think that stemmed from the pandemic, or do you think that's just the evolution of arts generally because a lot of companies are coming out of the pandemic and looking to approach their work differently. And what do you think that is for Eloize? Is it from the pandemic, or is it technology? What is it?
Well, I think pandemic was the trigger, and in the sense that everybody knew that that what we did depends on the presence of an audience, live performance shows. But everybody kind of had their head in the sand about something like that happening where it was so drastic where all of a sudden you weren't able to do any of it. If all your operation would stop. And we were caught like everybody else. I mean, all our eggs were on stage with, depending on the presence of an audience, buying tickets to see live. We couldn't do that anymore. The good thing is, I mean, it was a bit of a forced sabbatical. And when you take a sabbatical, usually you take a sabbatical either because you're completely exhausted and you sit on your couch and you catch up on Netflix, or you go on sabbatical to explore, to develop your skills, to see where you could have another passion, and just to get yourself out of what you normally do. Ours was forced, but we let go of Netflix and we decided to explore. And there's so many things that came up. Some didn't work. We're like, okay, well, that's not what it was. But others worked out really well. And we did an immersive experience expo with Jacques Cousteau of the Magdalena Islands. Now you'll see him. He's a diver. He's got amazing images of the Arctic. And Jeannot knew him, so they offered him, so proposed to him to take his images and his video and create an immersive experience so that people could see these images. And it was incredibly successful. So much so that we were creating a second one now. It's a planetarium in Montreal here about Voyage to Mars and Women in Science. They came to get us because they've seen what we did in Mario, but to bring this theatricality and the storytelling that Eloize is good at and loves to do to science. So, I think the pandemic made us realize how fragile we were, and that we had to take our head out of the sand. What we were good at into other aspects of.
All right, so we always finish our podcast with two questions. So these are these. So I'm going to give them to you now. So, what's your most favorite thing about your job or the industry?
Continuing to create this and develop and better this moment where artists meet audience. And that's always been for me what kept me. I can say brought me to the performing arts because I didn't know that. But when I discovered it, I fell in love with it. And since then, that's been a passion of mine to continue to see how we can better this moment, this relationship that we keep developing over the years. It's a marriage, right?
Absolutely. And to keep audiences coming to that connection, right? Because that's really important.
It's super important. And one of the things that we don't realize is a lot of times we say, well, we're there for the show, but the experience is much better. It encompasses a lot more people. And the experiences, that moment, yes, that you meet the audience is important, but then there's before the audience gets their feet into the theater, there is the experience starts. How do they buy their tickets? What do they see on social media and things like this? And it continues after they leave the audience. If you want to keep that relationship alive, you need to take care of the pre and the post moment of meeting.
I totally 100% agree. I think there's a lot more capitalization on the narrative building up to a show that can be done with live entertainment than there is right now. And I think that's what I would love to explore in the future, is how to document and share that journey to the live thing, because I think that's you and I have probably been through creation, so you know how interesting that process is, and to expose an audience to that gives them reason to go and see the end result, right? So I'm fascinated to see how we could make use of that through either social media or documentaries or any of those things. I keep feeling like there's a big opportunity that can be missed if you're not sharing that journey,
Completely.
Yeah. Now, the other question we have is, if you could change one thing about your job or the industry, what would you change?
One of the things, that's a good question. I think it's a perception that I would like to change. uh, and a perception from the people that come into this industry in order to make a profit. And I'll tell you, I'm going to try to make it succinct, but one of the things that, I was talking to you about this social and political ecosystem that happens into the creative industry, and the bigger the company becomes, the more intricate and political it becomes. And I think you've lived that in your career as well. I call that creativocracy. It's this kind of system. And within that, I called it that because I needed to put a name on all the observation that I've done over almost 40 years now that I've been in the business. And one of the things that I noticed is when we talk about this, talking about this experience, this moment, for me, the focus, if you want to be successful, has to be on the quality of that experience. All the people that surrounds that supports the artist, that supports the audience, the pre, getting in the theater and the post. If you focus on that and create the best experience possible, obviously one of the beautiful consequences of that is going to make money. The perception is when people come in to and you move from a single owner of a company, for example, that has this passionate creative company to be able to create some things and discover the beautiful idea that they can make a living out of their art. When somebody takes over and then there's multiple owners with shareholders and things like this, the perception is that the focus has to be on making money, making the company profitable. The problem with that is when your focus gets on that, everything else becomes secondary. Everything else becomes a tool that you can play with to help that ultimate goal. And the problem is that then you start justifying why the quality of that experience is not as important as it should be. That you start cutting on elements of that experience. And the problem is also is that it takes time if you start chipping away at that experience in small increments. It takes a while for the audience to realize that it's not as good as it used to be, or that they're not having as much fun as it used to be, or it's something that they've seen in the past. And a lot of times when that realization happens, it's too late. The company has suffered and they have to rebuild everything, specifically the trust with their audience. So if I had to change something, is this perception that in order to survive, they have to focus on profitability. That's, for me, is the kiss of death for any company. If they focus on the right thing, on the important thing, on the meaningful things, and put their energy there, there's risk for sure, but they have to have an element of risk in what they do. But if they focus on that, then, like I said, beautiful consequences is to make money out of it, because people want to see you. So
I love that answer, Richard. I totally resonate with that very viscerally. So I really appreciate that answer. It's one of the best ones I think we've had on our podcast thus far. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. It's nice to see you again. I know we've already met and spent some time together, but now we've done it formally on the podcast. So I really appreciate hearing about your experience, and now I know more about your ballet background. So,
well, thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure and to speak with you. And yes, super nice to see you again. And hopefully the next time we won't be so far away. Where are you right now? Are you in Dubai?
I'm in Hong Kong, yeah.
You're in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully it's nice over there and the weather is good. But thank you again. It was really appreciated.
Thank you, Richard.